Konbanwa and good evening. For our Japanese audience, Ohayou gozaimasu. Welcome to tonight's Geostrategy in the Grassroots panel discussion entitled Geostrategic Challenges Facing the U.S. and Japan 2023 Plus. I'm Mike Turner, President of the Japan Society of New Orleans. This discussion is made possible through a grant we received from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation through the National Association of Japan America Societies and the efforts of the Board of Directors of the Japan Society of New Orleans. Thank you for the faith and trust you put in Japan Society of New Orleans to host this event. Our online presentation has enabled the participation of an international audience, including a significant participation from Japan, so welcome. During tonight's discussion, if you would like to ask a question of our panelists, please type your question or comment in the chat section while viewing this event. I have the honor and the privilege to introduce our moderator tonight, Mr. Peter Kelley, President of the National Association of Japan American Societies. Peter announced his retirement as president at the 2022 annual meeting, and today is his last day as president of the National Association of Japan American Societies. We appreciate Peter's help tonight as he winds down from a magnificent performance as president. I've known Peter for over 10 years, and it was over dinner with him in 2011 that led to the revitalization of Japan Society of New Orleans after our Hurricane Katrina experience. Through his guidance and mentoring, Japan Society of New Orleans has strengthened its relationship with its sister city, Matsue City Shimane, with multiple visits and exchanges. Japan Society of New Orleans participated in the Tomodachi Exchange Program in 2014 and 2015, and through our own fundraising efforts, sent an exchange of young professionals to Matsue in 2019. We are currently raising funds to support an exchange with Matsue in 2024 to celebrate the 30-year anniversary of our sister city relationship. I'd like to publicly recognize Peter for his outstanding leadership, both with NAJAS and helping me as a friend and a mentor. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Peter. Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone to tonight's presentation. I'm Peter Kelley of the National Association of Japan America Societies. We're located in Washington, D.C., but the action is not in Washington, D.C. There are 38 Japan America Societies located all around the country. All of them, like the Society in New Orleans, are locally managed and locally funded, and they work to further the people-to-people relationship between the United States and Japan at the local level. The Japan Society of New Orleans has been in existence for 95 years. Congratulations. That is a long time for a not-for-profit to run, and they've been so successful under the leadership of my good friend Mike Turner. Mike received last year the Order of the Rising Sun, an imperial decoration in honor of his work at the Japan Society of New Orleans, and it was a pleasure for me to be there to watch that. The work of the National Association of Japan America Societies, based in Washington, D.C., is to provide Japan-related programming to our membership, which they might not be able to organize themselves. We offer, in partnership with foundations and funding organizations, we offer 6 different program series to our members. One on public affairs, tonight's program on geostrategy, 2 business speaker series, one featuring executives of Japanese companies that have invested in the United States, and that's in partnership with Keidon Ren, and another, the stories of American companies that have been successful in Japan, and that's with the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. We also support the Japan-U.S. military program, of which we've had several in New Orleans, honoring the service of Americans who served in the U.S. military in Japan. That is the largest number of Americans who've ever been to Japan and went there as part of their service to the United States. And finally, we have a cultural program featuring the collections of Japanese art collections in the United States. You have a very famous one in New Orleans. Tonight's program is called Geostrategy in the Grassroots. We began this program in 2018 in partnership with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Tokyo. The Sasakawa Peace Foundation is Japan's largest private philanthropic organization, and one of their focuses is the geostrategic challenges that Japan and the United States face. We partnered with Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and in particular, I am Murata, the director of the Japan-US program, in creating this particular program because we wanted to bring the kind of geostrategic discussions about the U.S. and Japan that happen nearly every week in Washington, D.C. We wanted to bring that kind of content outside of Washington, to cities outside of Washington where it's not heard that often. To do so, we created a program in which each event has one speaker from Japan and one from the United States. They're private individuals, they're not representatives of the government. And we asked them to talk in a conversational format about those strategic challenges. There are 8 of these programs happening in different cities around the United States this year, each with a different pair of speakers. We chose the format we chose this year, or the topic we chose this year, was, as you might imagine, the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for the United States and Japan in Asia. And we asked each of the pairs of speakers to think about it from a different point of view. Tonight's point of view relates to the issue of nuclear deterrence. Our most recent program, which will happen actually tomorrow in Honolulu, the next program deals with the implications for energy resources and energy supply. But tonight's discussion relates to the very difficult question of nuclear deterrence. And we've invited 2 speakers who are experts in nuclear deterrence, who will give you, each will talk for about 15 minutes at the outset. The first, Ankit Panda, and second, Masashi Murano. And then after that, the moderator, myself, will ask a few questions, and then we'll invite you all to submit your questions through the chat. I'd ask you not to submit your questions until after the speakers have completed their talk, so that we can focus on what they have to say first. Our first speaker is Ankit Panda, and Ankit is the Stanton Senior Fellow of Nuclear Policy in the Nuclear Policy Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That's a long title, but the Carnegie Endowment is a well-known think tank in Washington, D.C. He's also a senior editor of the Diplomat magazine, and you can read or listen to his articles on a regular basis in the Diplomat magazine. I recommend that. His specialties are nuclear strategy, arms control, missile defense, non-proliferation, emerging technologies, and extended deterrence. So we'll lead off with Ankit, and as he finishes, I will introduce our second speaker, Masashi Murano, after Ankit finishes. Ankit?
Great. Well, Peter, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And Mike, thank you for your introduction as well. I want to begin by, of course, thanking the Japan Society of New Orleans and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. I think it's difficult to find any American who does really any work on U.S.-Japan alliance issues and security who hasn't benefited from Sasakawa's support. And I count myself among that group, of course. We're I think here tonight to discuss a really timely set of issues. I think it's difficult to look around the headlines these days. Just to pluck a few from the last couple of weeks, Iran enriching uranium to 84%, Russian nuclear threats, North Korea testing long-range missiles, and not feel that something has fundamentally changed about the nuclear order that so many of us grew used to in the post-Cold War era. Before I get more into sort of the nuclear dynamics that are at play today in Northeast Asia and Japan's immediate neighborhood, I do want to just set the scene a little bit about the changes that I think Japan itself perceives in the region. I think, of course, this was best crystallized in the 3 remarkable and widely expected to be remarkable national security documents that the Kishida government released in December: the new national security strategy, the new national defense strategy, and the new defense capability construction plan for Japan, that together in cumulative, I think, show that Japan has fully acknowledged that the world has changed. And I think the processes that really led to these documents, of course, did not happen overnight. They are not entirely a result of Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. But certainly, I think the return of wars of territorial conquest to Europe was a wake-up call. I was in Singapore, for instance, last summer for the Shangri-La dialogue, where Prime Minister Kishida was the keynote speaker, and he looked all of us in the eye in the room, defense experts, strategists, military officers from around the region, from the US and China, and he delivered a memorable observation that Ukraine today might be East Asia tomorrow. And I think that really sets the tone for the kinds of anxieties that we now see in Japan. Japan, of course, is the United States' primary ally in East Asia. It is a recipient of American extended deterrence assurances. The United States commits to Japan's defense using the full range of capabilities, including nuclear weapons if necessary. And the US has clarified that commitment to Japan on a number of occasions, including in recent consultations on extended deterrence. But looking at the threat environment around Japan, I think it's undeniable that Japan's neighborhood is not an enviable one. In fact, in sort of setting the scene for my remarks, I talked about how the nuclear order has changed after 30 years. But I think really for Japan, or at least strategic elites in Tokyo, there's never really been a sense of complacence, even in the aftermath of the Cold War. The Soviet Union went away, but the Russian Federation, of course, remained. And while Russia's nature in the 1990s appeared to be quite different from the Soviet antecedent, I think Japan has wrangled quite a bit with Russia's true nature in the region. Former Prime Minister Abe, of course, took considerable political risks to try and achieve a peace treaty to finally resolve the status of the Northern Territories that Japan and Russia have long disputed to no avail. Meanwhile, of course, North Korea has radically, I think, changed the nature of the nuclear capabilities that it can bring to bear, not just in a full-scale conflict, but even in crises in the region. North Korea, of course, has been a familiar security challenge for Japan. Indeed, we can go all the way back to 1999 when North Korea first overflew Japanese territory with the Taepodong-1, which initiated a still continuing joint collaborative effort between the United States and Japan on missile defense technologies. And of course, the scope of the North Korean problem continues to only fester and grow worse with no diplomatic resolution in sight. And finally, of course, there's the issue that is really difficult to get around these days, which is the changing nature of China. Now, I think Japan, like so many countries in the early 2000s, as China continued to integrate itself into the global economy, acceded to the World Trade Organization, sought to be accommodated by the United States, the primary power, into the global economic order, had aspirations for what China might be. I think it's become clear under the last 10 years of rule by Xi Jinping in particular, that China will not be anything but a security challenge for Japan, which is openly, of course, acknowledged in Japan's recent national security strategy, which acknowledges that China is the most severe post-war threat since the Second World War that Japan has really had to contend with in its immediate neighborhood. There are, I think, other things that we do need to, of course, float to the surface here. And as difficult as it is for many of us as Americans who support the U.S.-Japan alliance, I think it is undeniable that after the experience of witnessing at least the United States approach to statecraft and geoeconomics and even geopolitics under the Trump administration, I think there has been a bit of a wake-up call in Tokyo that the reliability of the United States politically, and ultimately political reliability is the foundation of any alliance relationship, can no longer be taken for granted. Now, this does not mean that the U.S.-Japan alliance, of course, is on shaky ground. Far from it. I think the alliance is on quite strong ground at the moment. But the fact remains that strategic planners in Tokyo have to account for an uncertain future, 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line, where the role that the United States has played for Japan in the post-Cold War era in the second half of the 20th century, and at least in the first couple decades of the 21st century, can no longer perhaps be taken for granted. And so Japan will have to take things ultimately into its own hands. Now, across the three primary threats that I outlined, all around Japan, North Korea, Russia, and China, it's undeniable that nuclear weapons play a role. And of course, the role that nuclear weapons play is, I think, more palpable in at least in East Asia in the case of North Korea and China. But of course, there is an element to the nuclear threat from Russia as well. Russia in recent years has taken to reminding Japan of this fact by flying nuclear-capable bombers around Japanese airspace, requiring the Japanese air self-defense force to regularly scramble aircraft, for instance. But I think the crux of issues that the alliance faces right now with regard to nuclear deterrence, extended deterrence, and the alliance really, I think, relate to primarily China. And here I'll talk a little bit about what exactly is happening with China that is an important source of change for how the alliance might have to think about these issues going forward. So for a number of years, China had maintained a rather unusual nuclear force posture for a country of its size and with its geopolitical and geostrategic aspirations. Unlike the United States and the former Soviet Union and now Russia, China did not maintain a nuclear weapons stockpile with warheads ranging into the 4 digits. Of course, at the height of the Cold War, the US and Soviet arsenals ranged well into the 5 digits. China maintained a lean and effective nuclear force posture that until a few years ago consisted of a total stockpile of warheads numbering in the low 200s. That is in the process of changing right now. The United States assesses that China will have at least 700 nuclear warheads by 2027, perhaps as many as 1,000 by 2030, and perhaps yet 1,500 by 2035 if China continues on the trajectory that it seems to be on at the moment. Beginning in 2020, we began to see evidence of China building new silos for intercontinental range ballistic missiles in its western desert. This silo construction represents the most significant quantitative expansion and even qualitative force posture change in the Chinese arsenal in a number of decades. All the while this is happening, China is also largely expanding its so-called limited nuclear options. It's nuclear-capable missiles that are geared at regional targets, including American bases in Japan that might be involved in a contingency in the Taiwan Strait, for instance. The reasons this introduces new pressure points for the alliance is I think, not easy to appreciate initially, because, of course, as I said at the outset, China has always had nuclear weapons. Japan has harbored anxieties about China for a number of years, even predating the expansion of Chinese nuclear forces. But what's going on now, and I think one of the issues that the US and Japan are talking about in extended deterrence consultations, and one of the anxieties that I think will remain in Tokyo, is what it will mean when the United States and China have a relatively stable nuclear relationship between them by virtue of the very expansion of China's nuclear force, which will manifest, in my opinion, this is already manifested, but China clearly doesn't think so. But the goal here will be for China to manifest with the United States a condition, if not a policy, but a condition of mutual vulnerability, in the sense that both the United States and China, just like the United States and the Soviet Union after the advent of arms control and in the later half of the Cold War, where neither side will have any incentive to attempt a first strike on the other because the nuclear forces of the others are survivable and will be able to retaliate in a second strike. That is essentially the basis of stable nuclear deterrence. Now, as an American, that might sound all fine and well. It's, what's not to like about nuclear relationships between adversaries becoming more stable rather than less stable. The problem is, however, in the assurances that we give our allies, including, of course, Japan. Japan has, for instance, been concerned for a number of years about the prospect of conventional or even sub-conventional Chinese aggression or assertiveness in the East China Sea, for instance, where the two countries have long maintained a dispute over the Senkaku Islands, which Japan administers, but China has long coveted, and that China regularly tests Japan's resolve on with its Navy and Coast Guard, so on and so forth. Now, in a conventional limited conflict over the Senkaku Islands, which the United States since 2014 has explicitly clarified is covered under the US-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, Japan would, of course, like to be assured that the United States would take all means at its disposal, or at least rely on all means available to the United States, the full toolkit of our capabilities, including nuclear weapons if necessary, to defend every inch of Japanese territory. That assurance becomes much more difficult to make credible to our allies, including Japan, of course, when the nature of China's nuclear forces, or at least that condition of mutual vulnerability, begins to manifest between the United States and China. So this is a concern. In my opinion, it is a concern that can be resolved through various means. Of course, one way of resolving that concern is, I believe, what Japan is already doing, which is, of course, taking more responsibility for its own defense, for conventional deterrence. The traditional relationship between the United States and Japan, what has long been described as an alliance relationship with a sword and a shield, where the United States provides effectively the offensive firepower to Japan's defensive and non-offensive capabilities, is radically changing now. Japan is now equally going to be capable of delivering important strategic effects if necessary, of communicating to adversaries ranging from Beijing to Pyongyang alike, that Japan will be able to bring to bear a range of capabilities in its own defense. And here I think it's just worth going through some of the capabilities that Japan is in the process of acquiring as articulated in the new national defense strategy. These include, of course, standoff missiles, missiles capable of striking targets, including ships at longer ranges. This is not a new capability. Japan first articulated an agenda here with the 2018 National Defense Program guidelines, building on the 2013 National Security Strategy. Japan has long valued missile defenses, and this is going to be a continuing focus of Japanese efforts to deter adversaries. China and North Korea maintain large nuclear, conventional, and dual-capable missile arsenals that hold a range of targets in Japan at risk, and this will be a continuing focus. Japan is also looking at increasingly asymmetric capabilities, including uncrewed aerial platforms, looking at capabilities in emerging domains, cyberspace, space, the electromagnetic spectrum. Here, Japan has significant ambitions to improve its capabilities. Japan is seeking to better integrate its military command and control and intelligence capabilities. Intelligence, of course, is going to be an important component of making sure that the strike capabilities that Japan is pursuing can be militarily effective, even if the United States is not directly involved in cueing and assisting Japanese targeting, for instance. And more generally, Japan is seeking to build greater sustainability, more toughness, building up a capability to sustain its own production of munitions in peacetime, to reconstitute munitions that are spent in a conflict. And all of this will conclude in, I think, Japan having a much more robust capability to deter opportunistic aggression by a range of adversaries. I want to close, however, by really just emphasizing that nuclear weapons and the salience of nuclear weapons are very much on the minds of top Japanese leaders in this current environment. The salience of nuclear weapons more broadly in international politics, from Europe to East Asia, I think, has erupted in just a number of years. Nuclear scholars described the end of the Cold War as heralding a second nuclear age. Some of the themes of that second nuclear age, for instance, included the securing of the former Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, including in Ukraine, which of course relinquished the nuclear weapons that remained on its territory. The second nuclear age also saw a greater concern on nonproliferation in South Asia, on the Korean Peninsula, and of course ill-fated efforts in Iraq and eventually Iran and Syria and Libya. But now I would argue that we are heralding, or we are seeing the start of a third nuclear age, where fundamentally we see the return of strategic competition between superpowers. The multipolar dynamics at play today between the US, China, and Russia, I think, are really unprecedented. But we are also dealing with several precedented challenges. And I would argue that many of the extended deterrence challenges that we now face in East Asia do have useful antecedents in the Cold War in Europe. It's not an exact, of course, mapping, but I think there is a lot that the US and Japan and the alliance in general can do to shore up, of course, our collective capability and resilience against limited coercion by China, attempts by North Korea as well, by looking to that history, and of course remaining focused on the present as well, looking at the indicators, the dynamics, and the intentions of leaders like Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un as we think about this new era that both countries are heading into. So once again, thank you very much to the Japan Society of New Orleans for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to, of course, hearing from Masashi Murano, who I learn quite a bit from every time I hear him speak, and to the audience's questions today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ankit. That's a comprehensive and also a bracing description. You mentioned a third nuclear age in which the salience of nuclear weapons is is erupting. That's a good challenge, and something to that we'll get to in the question and answer session. Our speaker from Japan is Masashi Murano, who is actually located at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. He's the Japan Chair Fellow at the Hudson Institute. His specialties are U.S.-Japan defense cooperation, nuclear and conventional deterrence, and analysis. He was previously at the Okazaki Institute, a think tank in Tokyo, and is a graduate of Takshoku University in Japan. Welcome, Masashi, and over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and the kind introduction. Also, that I'm very glad to join this event organized by the Japan Society of New Orleans, and also thanks to the supported for the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Today's our rule-based international order is being challenged by the nuclear armed regional adversaries. And simultaneously, these are Russia, North Korea, and China. And also that as Ankit has already mentioned, that the Japanese government has revised major strategic documents at the end of the last year and has decided to roughly double the defense budgets over the next 5 years. I think that this is the major steps, given that Japan's defense budget has been flat for a long time. However, it is essentially irrelevant to be proud of how much effort has been made compared to our past situation. What is more important to be prepared for future risks and deter the crises is to compare our current situation with those of our future adversaries. And so that while it is difficult to assess challenges in the security environment and its future trends, but I think the one thing it's certain in the traditional security realms, it is that offensive dominance is increasingly prominent, and defender sides, which mean that status quo powers are becoming more easily outmatched or overmatched. For example, I would like to a little bit step into the detail of that security environment which facing Japan. My expertise and the Ankit expertise has really overlapped to that, but yeah, I'm trying to do a little bit more step into the detail of that current situation of it. For example, that the North Korea, in case of the North Korea, they conducted to the largest number of the ballistic missile launches ever in 2022. It depends on how to count up that number of itself, but it's with 66 launches. This is the largest number of in the history. In addition, the number of the variants increased from the high readiness with the solid fuel, the rocket motors, and tactical to strategic ranges. Also, simultaneous launch capabilities, precision guidance, cluster warheads, and maneuverable warheads by the North Korea. It's so-called hypersonics. And also, as we know, that the denuclearization of North Korea has not progressed, and their nuclear and the missile capabilities has improved. And in terms of it, some government, including the U.S. and Japanese government, calls these North Korean behavior as a provocation. But I think that description is not personally, this description in terms of the provocation is not appropriate for describe as an actual situation what we face. So why I think about it? So before the explaining of the reason that I would like to look into the situation about China. According to the annual report of the Pentagon, US Department of Defense, China launched the 135 ballistic missiles in a year. So that is roughly twice as many as North Korea's one. But Chinese missile launches are rarely called the provocations. This is why because their missile launches by the People Liberation Army are the practical exercise to train batteries and improve their readiness. So in other words, that North Korea's missile launches are not provocations. So they're technical or operational test launches, just like Chinese missile launches. So this is, from my perspective, this is the clear, we need to clearly distinguish those differences from the past. And also that they are focusing on enhancing their missile arsenal because it is critically important for them to prevent US intervention when some contingencies happen. In the recent, some studies, it's one of the major US think tank in DC, the CSIS War Games on Taiwan crisis. China was unsuccessful in the military invasion to Taiwan in the most of the 24 possible scenarios. But what is important about the lessons and learns of these war games is not the cases in which China's operations were unsuccessful, but the exceptional cases in which they are successful. The cases in which China succeeded in suppressing Taiwan was in the scenario in which Japan did not allow to the use of US military bases in Japan. And as a result, the United States did not or cannot intervene. And then the Taiwan have to fight there alone. And also that the combat radius of the US major fighter aircrafts include carrier-based fighter aircraft is about 700 miles, and they cannot continue to their power projection without further deployment. So this means that without Japanese logistical support, the United States would not be able to make a defense commitment to Northeast Asia. This is also true in some contingencies or crises happened in the Korean Peninsula. You may recall that the situation at the Korean War of 1950. The joint United Nations Joint Task Force has conducted to the Incheon landing operations was launched from Japan. But at that time, North Korea did not have any means to prevent US forces from launching operation from Japan. But now they can. Then, as the Ankit described, North Korea can threaten Japan and disrupt US operations through the psychological intimidation or physical obstruction combined with their nuclear weapons and missiles. So what I have just mentioned are major security challenge in Northeast Asia, but there are also the other issues facing international community, including the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this is with the possibility of the crisis occurring simultaneously or in short series in these multiple regions. Our defense resources, no matter how much we have, they will not be enough, and no countries can fill those gaps alone. So that reason, therefore, we need to share our challenges we face with each other, or appropriately allocated our roles and missions and capabilities. So that's the reason why we need to cooperate more closely with each other, including maintain that the U.S. credibility of U.S. extended deterrence. Also, that as Ankit mentions, Japan's own long-range strike capability, which will acquire in the foreseeable future, that's also that has make an essential role to reinforce and substitute the U.S. extended deterrence in this region. So I would like to. I'm looking forward to some discussing further about these issues more detail, but in the Q&A sessions. So I'll stop here. Thanks so much.
Masashi, so we've had two very clear presentations, and what I want to do now, I will ask people continue to think about what the speakers have said and put questions in the chat section. As I'll ask a few questions right now, but we hope that those in the audience will type the questions into the chat as you see on the screen right now, and we will engage both of our speakers with those questions. Let me start off with a couple of questions here. First, for both Ankit and Masashi, and please feel free to ask each other questions as we do this. But we hear frequently these days the word extended deterrence. We hear that not only in relation to Japan, but also in relation to South Korea and other U.S. allies, including the Philippines. Could you each give your sense of what extended deterrence actually means in both the conventional and the nuclear situations, and how is it related among the different U.S. allies in the United States? For example, how does extended deterrence in Korea relate to Japan and the Philippines? Ankit, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Happy to take that one. So extended deterrence has really been something that the United States, here I'm talking about the post-Second World War era primarily, but it's something we've been in the business of doing for a long time now with our treaty allies. And so this includes Japan, South Korea, NATO allies, and it's effectively a guarantee that the United States will use the full range of capabilities to deter and, if necessary, respond to an attack on our allies effectively. It's sometimes called a nuclear umbrella, colloquially. Now, I think the nuclear umbrella term can be a little bit misleading because the United States doesn't actually commit to use nuclear weapons in retaliation for an attack. It tells allies that nuclear weapons are available as the menu, as part of the total package of capabilities that might be brought to bear on adversaries. Now, the reasons the United States does this are really many-fold. We see our allies as a useful, of course, force multiplier for the United States, a great, unique asset that we have that our adversaries largely do not. But also, it has to do with non-proliferation. Of course, in the nuclear age, and particularly when many of these relationships took hold, and beginning with the North Atlantic Treaty all the way to the U.S.-Japan Treaty, there was a level of curiosity around the world, including among many of our allies, in nuclear weapons of their own, and extending our deterrent capabilities, telling our allies that we would defend every inch of their territory as if it was ours, which is not an easy thing to do, not an easy thing to make credible, was also an effort to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, which the United States came around to believing was in our interest, regardless of which countries might pursue them, friend or foe. So I'll stop there, and I'll let Masashi chime in.
Well, the follow on that some Ankit's comments that in case of the extended deterrence that the U.S. provided to some several way on the several components of the contents of the extended deterrence. In our community, the frequently to describe as one is the hardware the guarantees, and another one is the software guarantees. The hardware means that the kind of the actual the weapon systems, combination of the weapon system or delivery systems and the nuclear warheads, like strategic bombers or ICBMs and or the strategic submarines, including the sea-launched ballistic missiles. But and in the case of Europe, from the Cold War era, they are, in addition to those kind of strategic nuclear triad, in addition to they provided to them actual forward deployable dual-capable systems. It's called dual-capable aircraft, DCA, with nuclear gravity bomb, B-61s. And it's these systems forward deployed at the several NATO allies to ensure that the U.S. commitment. But unlike those kind of the NATO like the nuclear sharing arrangement, in the Northeast Asia or in the Pacific region, the US does not apply to those kind of forward deployed hardware systems. Instead of they are provided to some software mechanism, which means that the bilateral means the US and Japan and US and ROK, the consultation mechanism about the extended deterrence, including the nuclear. In case of Japan, it's so-called US-Japan Extended Deterrence Dialogue, and also that in Korea, US ROK Alliance has a similar consultation mechanism. And also that according to the latest version, not the latest version, the Trump administration version and Biden administration's nuclear posture review, it is one of the key documents to describe of the U.S. nuclear policy. They does not deny of the potential possibility of the apply to the forward deployed option in Northeast Asia, like NATO countries. But personally, as you know, that in case of in Korea, they are now is discussing about potential possibility of the adapt these option, forward deployable option. But at the same time, in case of Japan, some tragic history in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the anti-nuclear sentiments, I think that it is a little bit difficult to apply in case of Japan. Forward deployed option includes some or hosted nuclear weapons in the Japanese soil. Even some crisis going to be closed. Also, not just the psychological barrier, but also that in actual more strategic or tactical reality within Japan. I think that I'm another big supporter of the forward deployed option because of as I a little bit describe of the current situation or the upgraded capability by China and North Korea. The precision strike capabilities, including nuclear against Japanese soil, is becoming more serious. So if we are considered to the forward deployed option like NATO, I think that dual capable aircraft or gravity bomb option is not, it doesn't have sufficient actual military advantage against China or Chinese or North Korean target from Japan. So that personally that Japan and the U.S. alliance should be actually we are already focused on the more survivable or invulnerable option like a submarine-based nuclear deterrent or bomber-based nuclear deterrent. So that the problem is that how to if the people has more seek to more reliable extended deterrence guarantee from the United States, I think that we should upgrade our consultation mechanism, not a forward deployed option. So that's my current idea, to strengthen our extended deterrence impact.
Mm-hmm. So extended deterrence involves also Japan considering its own things like forward deployed options. Let's Ankit, you mentioned the connection between deterrence and non-proliferation. Let's talk about non-proliferation for a moment. What is the status these days of non-proliferation? And I ask it in the context of the Russian withdrawal from the nuclear treaty, the notion that China is not really involved, although, as you mentioned, it's expanding quite rapidly its nuclear arsenal. There isn't any inclusion that I'm aware of China in a non-proliferation context, and other countries are, as you so quaintly put it, expressing curiosity about nuclear weapons. What is the status these days around the world of nuclear non-proliferation, and how does that relate to Japan's consideration of extended deterrence?
Sure. Yeah. So just by way of starting, we are fortunate to live in a world where only 9 countries possess nuclear weapons. That was not something that I think, for instance, I think the most famous example is President Kennedy, who feared a world where by the start of the 21st century, we might have more than 20 countries with nuclear weapons. So broadly speaking, global non-proliferation efforts have been remarkably successful. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is, of course, the bedrock of that arrangement. It's one of the most successful treaties with wide subscription. And North Korea remains the only country to have ever left that treaty and build nuclear weapons of its own. India, Pakistan, and Israel, of course, never signed on to the treaty to begin with. And apart from that, we have the 5 nuclear weapon states who detonated a nuclear device before January 1st, 1970, thereby gaining privileged status in that treaty arrangement. That includes the U.S., U.K., France, and of course Russia and China. Today, I think there are a number of disturbing developments. So Russia's war on Ukraine, I think, has generated a lot of commentary on the precedent that it sets. Ukraine, of course, is a particularly poignant case because, as I mentioned briefly in my opening comments, Ukraine was a Soviet successor state that had former Soviet nuclear weapons and facilities on its soil. Those capabilities were repatriated to the Russian Federation, which inherited the former Soviet Union's nuclear forces. In exchange for relinquishing those capabilities, which Ukraine did not command, but nevertheless could have accessed over a number of years, let's just say, the Ukrainians received security guarantees, including from Russia, that their sovereignty and territorial integrity would be respected. And lo and behold, we now are in the second year of a war of aggression by Russia, a member of the P5 in the Non-Proliferation Treaty against Ukraine. And so this has generated a lot of anxiety that the non-proliferation bargain that many non-nuclear weapon states were asked to accept might no longer be tenable. I think that's going a little bit too far. I still think there are substantial deterrents, broadly speaking, to proliferation around the world. But Peter, the second part of your question was about non-proliferation and extended deterrence. And here I think the U.S. is facing a challenge that we once faced during the Cold War, which is the problem of allies having doubts about about our extended deterrent capabilities, and potentially looking to nuclear weapons of their own. I'm not talking about Japan here, where there has been a long-standing debate about, of course, nuclearization, but it's very quiet. It's a debate that's seldom heard publicly in Tokyo. But in South Korea, where conversations that used to happen after a few drinks in a dimly lit bar at night are now happening every day out in the sunlight, in the newspapers, and the op-ed pages, and public opinion polls. There is a groundswell of public support for South Korea acquiring nuclear weapons. There are, of course, strategic elites, think tankers, writing regular articles in favor of South Korea building its own nuclear weapons to deter North Korea and to hold its own in a region that's increasingly looking less friendly, including against China. And of course, most remarkably, for the first time since South Korea transitioned to a democracy, the president of South Korea, briefly, not as a policy gesture in a sort of wide-ranging set of remarks, alluded to the prospect of Seoul building nuclear weapons. And this is a problem that the United States, I think, is going to have to address going forward. It is a problem that the Biden administration is trying to address. But it relates to one of the things I talked about in my intro, which is the perception that the United States perhaps is no longer as reliable as it once was. And even if the U.S. is reliable, there is an idea now that for any country that depends on the United States for its security, or at least for any country that depends on the United States as the cornerstone for its own security, as the backstop, as especially the nuclear backstop. There is no longer a safe assumption that the United States, over presidential administration from presidential administration to another, will continue to treat allies and treat the enterprise of extended deterrence in a stable, reliable way. Right? I would, of course, like to say that that's wrong, but I don't think I can say that in good faith anymore. And I think that's a deeply unsettling observation, because effective extended deterrence, I do think, has been a successful tool for the United States in ensuring that nuclear weapons do not spread. And I think it continues to be in our interest to ensure that the number of nuclear weapon states, again, friendly countries or unfriendly countries, remain low in the world. I think that's good for American national interests. But that, I think, is what I would say is that the enterprise of extended deterrence in this world where nuclear-armed coercion by countries like Russia and eventually North Korea and possibly even China is going to be something we face, will be something the U.S. has to think long and hard about.
Mm-hmm. And Masashi, what, from Japan point of view, China is adding nuclear weapons at a rapid clip without participating in non-proliferation discussions, or at least at this point. How does that look from Japan?
Yes, in the beginning, that I would like to a little bit add to some comment about the lessons and learns about the in case of the Ukraine, or the lessons and learns from the Budapest Memorandum. I think that lessons and learns from this situation, which means that after the decision of the Ukrainian government to return their physically deployed nuclear weapon to some Russia, it is a security guarantee. I think that the security guarantee is like a gardening. What I mean by this is that you should not make it once and leave it alone. So that it is, if we agree to some kind of security guarantees, even it's a kind of memorandum or treaty allies, we need to maintain that those credibility or guarantees needed to regularly some physical exercises, including nuclear, or which I mentioned earlier, it's kind of some consultation mechanism about the operational plannings or some other scenario-based discussions. So that in case of the Budapest Memorandum, the Russia, US, some other countries has not provided to Ukraine some of those kind of tangible guarantees, including to prevent the Russian invasion as one of the sign of the unlike NATO's US-Japan alliance or US-LOK alliance. So yes, but it is true that the deterioration of the Budapest Memorandum is a kind of deteriorated of the guarantee of the nuclear or security guarantees. But at the same time, as a reality, the Ukraine government does not have the physical capability to maintain those kind of nuclear weapons and the command and control systems. So that we need to focus on more detail about the reality, what's the situation of between after those memorandums, and also that in case of in terms of the potential risk of the nuclear proliferations in Northeast Asia, including Japan or Korea. Sometimes I've been asked interesting question from the Korean friends or some medias. That is, what kind of the factors is more significant or the decisive to Japan seriously consider about going nuclear armament by ourselves? I always answer about these questions as a Japanese that that's potential decisive factors will be not North Korea, will not be China. That is what's South Korea do? So what I mean by this is that our historic library between, it doesn't mean that the Japanese to think about potential adversaries as, it doesn't mean that the public to see the South Korea as a potential adversaries, but to think about the historic libraries. If the ROK governments or their public is seriously going to the nuclear armament or reintroduction of the U.S. nuclear weapons again, like during the Korean War, during the Cold War, I think that it is. I'm not confident to persuade Japanese public by logically or strategically. It is not a good option for us. As I mentioned earlier, ground-based or before deployed the nuclear deterrent does not has significant meanings to deter North Korea or China. But it is a little bit difficult to those kind of public sentiments by conservatives, Japanese politicians, or the public cannot. It is a little sounds hard to persuade some logically ways. So that I'm always emphasizing to U.S. American friends what U.S. allowed to South Korea. It's directly affects on how Japanese response. So that we should not avoid some nuclear cascade in this nuclear proliferation cascade in this region. So that's my current argue about that issues.
Mm-hmm. Ankit, you mentioned lessons from the Cold War, and one of the decisions that was made by U.S. treaty allies in NATO early on, the UK and France, was that they felt they needed to have their own nuclear deterrent in order not to rely on the United States too much. At this stage, all these many years later, are the small nuclear deterrents that those two countries possess, are they deterrents? Or what effectively are they these days? And what lessons might one learn from those two treaty allies possessing small nuclear arsenals?
Well, Peter, I think the question you've asked is one of the big open questions in the field of nuclear strategy, which is the question of what deters, how much deters, and how do we measure how deterrence is working and when it's working. And so, of course, those countries retain those nuclear weapons because they do believe it contributes to their security. The UK, of course, maintains a fairly streamlined, minimal. I mean, both UK and France primarily rely on survivable sea-based nuclear weapons. But the development of their nuclear forces has been quite different historically, actually. I mean, the US and UK have an extremely special collaborative relationship that extends to the nuclear enterprise. In fact, the next warhead for the United Kingdom is pretty much entirely reliant on the United States modernizing its own Navy warhead with a program known as the W-93, whereas France could not be more different. The French have maintained fierce independence regarding their nuclear decision-making and nuclear force posture. But effectively, I would say, look, I mean, the way to think about nuclear weapons generally is that there is a school of thought that nuclear weapons, through their very dramatic effects, are sufficient to deter in very small numbers. This has not been the prevailing, of course, ideology that I think prevailed in the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, when there was a contrary view that the so-called balance of terror that needed to prevail between the two countries was actually quite delicate. And so this is why we see both the US and the Soviet Union build their nuclear forces into the tens of thousands of warheads and do targeting by sort of putting multiple warheads on a range of targets because they wanted high probabilities that these targets would be destroyed effectively. But this is, I think, a fundamentally unresolvable question, the question of what will deter. Uncertainty, the manipulation of risk are inherent to the very enterprise of nuclear deterrence. And this is, I think a good way to maybe tie this back to our conversation today here is the debates that are now happening here in Washington about what the United States needs to do to manage nuclear competition with both Russia and China as China expands the size of its nuclear forces. For a number of years, we have treated China as a so-called lesser included case of our deterrence relationship with Russia. i.e. the thinking being that any nuclear force we maintain sufficient to deter Russia will be sufficient of also deterring China. But now with China's nuclear force growing in size and the prospect, or at least concerns in the United States that Russian and Chinese collusion may continue and deepen, if not to an alliance, then something of a long-term entente, I think this is raising, some uncomfortable questions here about what the United States will need to do. I have my own thoughts on that, but that's perhaps for another day.
Masashi, any thoughts from you about what the experience of maintaining a small nuclear arsenal in the UK and France means for Korea and Japan?
Well, that I basically agree with that, Ankit, the opinions of it, and yeah, exactly that. Even UK's and France, that the nuclear forces is relatively small, but exactly that their nuclear deterrence that were functionally embedded with the US nuclear deterrence as a part of. In case of France, they are a little bit different, but basically that they're or our potential adversaries, which mean that mainly Russia or former Soviet unions, has need to care about those kind of UK's and the France capabilities is a part of the NATO's collective self-defense as the structurally. But as at the same time, I'd like to emphasize on the importance of that deterrence is not only the nuclear part of it. When we think about the more rational or reliable the deterrent capabilities, we need to care about how to the linked or these kind of escalation ladders from the lower level to the more higher level. It's in the during the Cold War, it's so-called flexible response strategy. And in case of the Europe, that they are actually trying to combine with it depends on the historical trends. They need to care about that both of the both means that in the nuclear part, but now is Northeast Asia. They are trying to adapt those kind of the flexible essence of the flexible response, or we can say that it's a kind of new type of the formation, new type of format with the conventional and the nuclear integrations in the Northeast Asia. What I mean by this is that our Northeast Asian allies, including Japan and Korea, still rely on the higher level of the extended deterrence, rely on the US nuclear extended deterrence. But at the same time, those both countries trying to expand in their role by the conventional means. In case of the Korea, they have the very sophisticated conventional strike capability against the North Korea. Also that the Korea and US ROK alliance has a long time history to collaborate with the conventional operational plans and its executions. And then that as I a little bit mentioned about the current Japanese effort, and Ankit also mentioned, Japanese government has decided to acquire their own long-range strike capabilities. They are basically conventional, but I believe that those kind of conventional, Japanese conventional capabilities will play the important roles to substitute the U.S. conventional capabilities in this area, but also it's connected to some U.S. nuclear capabilities. This is because that if Japanese and the U.S. the conventional long-range conventional capability can threaten or targeting to the Chinese or North Korean dual capable systems. We need to automatically care about the potential risk of nuclear escalations from their side. So in that case, that even our Japanese capabilities are conventional, we need to think about how to escalate of the conflict of the war, going to not only the conventional level but also nuclear level, so that our capabilities and its integration would make us some nature to how to the U.S. and allies in Asia to care about the potential risk of the nuclear escalation. So that is one of the the tailored deterrent approach in the Northeast Asia. So that in the way of that, in what's happening in Northeast Asia.
In relation to that conventional, the conventional work in both Japan and Korea, a question from the audience relates to the possibility of technological cooperation between the United States and Japan relating to the conventional deterrence. Is there a lot going on in that area where the two countries are working together?
Yeah, I can briefly take that. So, as I think I mentioned earlier, the U.S. and Japan have been collaborating on the development of advanced missile defense interceptors now for more than 20 years, resulting in the Standard Missile Block 2A interceptor, which is in the process of being deployed on American ships and eventually on Japanese ships. It will have a capability against a range of ballistic missiles from North Korea. With regard to the question in front of us on laser ship-based missile defense interceptors, as best as I can tell, the United States has conducted a number of experiments with laser-based interceptors over the last 15-ish years. None of them have been sufficiently encouraging to promote further study. And I think in the US-Japan context, there isn't necessarily an appetite, but I can't rule it out. It could certainly crop up one day that the US and Japan decide to carry out joint R&D on laser Aegis. But I think for reasons of cost effectiveness and reliability, and primarily just, I think, doing what we know quite well, I do think it still makes sense to focus on kinetic missile defense interceptors.
Masashi, technical cooperation between the two countries?
That in terms of the laser missile defense systems is as Ankit described, that the technical and the cost effectiveness has not make sense for the potential collaboration area between the US and Japan. But in terms of the advanced some cooperation about the missile defense, Japanese and the U.S. government has now is considering about a couple of the areas. One is the space-based tracking layer, not only including ballistic missiles, but also the hypersonic cruise missiles or the hypersonic glide vehicles. To tracking of those kind of the threats that we need to some more advanced or broader range of the tracking sensor network, not only the terrestrial ones, but also space-based one. So that is one of the potential areas to collaborate with Japanese and US. And another one is the intercepting area. US has already started to, United States Missile Defense Agency has started on the hypersonic glide defense programs. It's called the GPI, glide-phased interceptors. But at the same time, the Ministry of Defense has trying to start it to the experiment or the capability development of almost the similar areas. So that is there is another potential collaboration area between the two governments. So that's I think that looking forward to what's going on.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We've had an interesting discussion. These topics used to be referred to as thinking about the unthinkable, but as Ankit and Masashi have said to us, these are issues we do need to think about. And Ankit, you mentioned the notion of a third nuclear age, and some of the terminology that we hear in the discussion today is familiar to those of us who remember the first nuclear age, but it will be new to many to many people, to a generation that might not remember that nuclear age as well. One last question from me then, a short one for both of you, is: are we ready for the third nuclear age? And what do we need to do to be ready?
I think we're starting, and I think there's a lot of work to be done. There's questions without easy answers, but that's why it's going to take, I think, the combined intellectual efforts of the United States and its allies and other like-minded countries to figure this out, and of course prevent nuclear competition from turning into nuclear conflict or nuclear use. I think that's absolutely the imperative that we need to work towards.
Masashi?
yes, that yes means that it's the beginnings. Also, I think that to one of the important point is that to preparation or realistic or well understanding of the not just the expert community but also in public. As I mentioned earlier, that our potential adversaries, the theory of victory, is focusing on the potential risk of the conventional warfare under the nuclear shadow. It means it's some nuclear threatening or nuclear blackmailing against our public. But we are actually prepared, if it is possible, to prepare for the collectively about these risks, that we can be able to handling about these risks. And then as a result that their potential adversaries, the strategic objectives has not been succeeded, it's going to be more difficult. So that is this kind of event to talking about the nuclear issues is the one of the essential to more deepening or more deeper understanding of that to the public, so that it was good opportunity to be discussing about that issue. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. We hope that the exchange of these, we've heard in this exchange, we've heard a perspective from the U.S. and a perspective from Japan. As Masashi says, a lot of this relates to the perception in the public, and we hope that discussions like this help to generate awareness of the relationship between the United States and Japan. States like Louisiana have a deep economic relationship with Japan, particularly in Louisiana's case, in the natural gas field. Very strong connections on that area between the United States and Japan. Discussions of issues that the two countries face in common, like this one, don't often happen. And we hope that hosting the event here in New Orleans has added to your awareness of the U.S.-Japan relationship and the challenges we face. Our thanks to the Japan Society of New Orleans and Mike Turner and Candace Huber for hosting the event tonight, and also to our partner, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Japan. Mike?
Peter, thank you so much. You've just watched this program on Japan Society of New Orleans YouTube channel. Please subscribe for additional events, or if you wish to view this program at a later date. Feel free to pass on our YouTube channel information to anyone you think might be interested in this program. I'd like to thank our grantors again, Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the National Association of Japan American Societies, for their generous support. Thanks to our moderator and panelists, Mr. Peter Kelley, Mr. Ankit Panda, Mr. Masashi Murano, for a great discussion tonight. I asked the speakers to stay online after this, just for a little housekeeping. Finally, we're always looking for new members to join our ranks to help support this and other programming of Japan Society of New Orleans. Please feel free to join or donate via our website, japansocietyofneworleans.org. Many thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. Good night and oyasumi nasai.